There is a room in Athens, more than 2000 years old, where men have gathered after dinner to talk about love. Wine moves slowly around the circle. Each guest, in turn, rises to praise Eros until a woman's word arrive, spoken through the mouth of Socrates, and the room tilts. Diotima tells him that love does not begin where we think it begins. It begins in the body, in the ache for one beautiful face, one particular presence whose absence has suddenly become unbearable. But if the lover is patient, if the lover is honest, that longing does not stay put, it climbs from one body to the beauty found in every body, from bodies to the beauty of the mind, a character, a way of moving through the world, from minds to the beauty of ideas themselves, justice, courage, the shape of a well lived life. And at the very top of this ladder, if one climbs far enough, love arrives, somewhere almost unbearably vast, not a person anymore, but beauty itself, unmixed with anything that fades. This is the oldest surviving argument the West possesses about what happens when we fall in love with someone. That the feeling is real and true and not to be dismissed, but that it is also a door, not a room. We are meant to walk through it. Most of us, understandably, would rather stay in the doorway forever, standing beside the one face that let us glimpse something larger. Plato does not blame us for lingering there. He only insists that the door was never the point. Aristotle, his student, distrusted the height of that ladder. He preferred solid ground. In his account, the highest love is not a mystical ascent, but a particular kind of friendship. One where two people love each other, not for pleasure, not for usefulness, but for who the other person is, and wish good things for them, for no reason beyond that. This is a quieter kind of love. It does not transcend the world, it simply insists on being trustworthy inside it. Travel east, and the ladder becomes a different shape entirely. Not a staircase rising away from the body, but a spiral where longing itself is treated as sacred. In the devotional poetry of India, in the verses sung to Krishna by Radha, and by every poet who has stood in her place since, separation is not the opposite of love. Separation is where love becomes most itself. The Sanskrit word for this is virah, the ache of beloved's absence, and the tradition does not rush to cure it. It sits with the ache, turns it over, finds in it a fullness that presence alone cannot offer. To long for someone in this telling is not evidence that love is incomplete. It is evidence that love has become large enough to hurt. A parallel fire burns in the poetry of the Sufis. A love so total it becomes the engine of the cosmos itself. Rumi and Ibn Arabi both insist that the beloved's face is a mirror where the lover truly loves, reflected back is the divine. To love a person with your whole attention, they suggest, is already a kind of prayer, whether you meant it as one or not. What both traditions share, and what the Greek ladder shares with them underneath its different vocabulary, is a refusal to treat longing as a problem to be solved. The problem, if there is one, is only impatience, the demand that love resolve itself quickly into comfort. The mystics of both traditions ask instead, what if the ache is not standing between you and the fullest experience of love, but is the fullest experience of love wearing an unfamiliar face? Not every serious mind has trusted mysticism. Some have wanted love to hold still long enough to be defined. In the 17th century, a lens grinder in Amsterdam named Baruch Spinoza attempted exactly this. With the patience of a geometry, love, he proposed, is joy, nothing more mysterious than that, accompanied by the awareness that someone else caused it. No divine ladder, no cosmic mirror, just a mind tracking with total honesty where its own joy came from and naming the source. There is something almost startling in how little this definition asks you to believe. It does not require fate or destiny or souls once split in two and searching for their other half. It only requires that you notice this person near me, and something in me lifts for a mind that trusts reason over rupture. And there is no shame in being such a mind. Spinoza offers something rare, a definition of love that a rational person can hold without feeling they have surrendered their rationality to get it. Centuries later, the American philosopher Harry Frankfurt would arrive at something structurally similar from a different direction. He argued that we do not love people because we have first judged them valuable, the way we might judge a good investment. Loving someone is partly what makes them matter to us in that particular irreplaceable way. Love, on this account, is not a reaction to value already there. It is one of the ways a human being comes to have a will at all, a way of caring that gives your choices their ultimate point, without anything to love. In this sense, there is no for the sake of which to act. But precision was never going to be the whole story, because human beings do not fall in love the way water finds its level. They fall in love the way a person walks towards a cliff they can partly see and partly refuse to see. In the 19th century, Denmark, a young philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard fell entirely, helplessly in love with a woman named Regine Olsen. She loved him back. He proposed, and then a year later, he broke it off, mailed her the ring, walked away from the one uncomplicated happiness his life ever offered him, because he could not see how to be a husband and a writer and the kind of Christian he needed to become, all at once. He spent the rest of his life writing about why. He described a self that could live aesthetically, chasing beautiful moments and never committing to any of them, or ethically choosing one person and binding a whole life to that choice, or hardest of all, religiously, where even that binding is offered up and surrendered again. He never stopped grieving the door he closed, but he also never pretended the grief proved he had chosen wrongly. Some griefs, he suggests, are simply the price of having chosen at all. Not everyone who wrote seriously about love in the century was so willing to romanticize the wound. Arthur Schopenhauer looked at the entire drama, the longing, the obsession, the sense that one particular person is irreplaceable, and saw something closer to a trick. Beneath every love affair, he argued, an impersonal biological will is quietly at work, arranging the next generation, using our most private raptures as its instrument. What feels like the freest, most personal choice we ever make is, underneath, the species choosing through us. It is not a comfortable idea, but it is worth sitting with precisely because it is uncomfortable. Because a love that has looked its own machinery in the eye and still chooses to matter is steadier than a love that was never willing to ask the question. For a very long time, nearly everyone writing about love, East and West, mystic and rationalist, was, without quiet noticing, describing love from one particular vantage point, as though the lover were free to climb Diotima's ladder, or wrestle with Kierkegaard's choice, or test Spinoza's definition without asking who was expected to simply wait at the bottom of the ladder, tending the house the climber returned to. In the middle of the 20th century, Simone de Beauvoir wrote the correction. She observed with unsparing clarity that women across history has been handed a very different instruction about love than men were. A man in love adds another region to a life already full of other regions: work, ambition, friendship, and the world. A woman in love, she argued, has too often been taught to make love her entire territory, to disappear into the beloved, to call that disappearance devotion, and to make the loss of herself for the depth of her feeling. This was not, she was careful to insist, an argument against love. It was an argument against a love built on a hidden asymmetry, a person free to remain a whole person while loving, the other required to become smaller in order to prove that she loved enough. The philosophical inheritance this leaves us is a demand, not a rejection. That love, to be worth the word, has to be something two whole people choose to build together, neither one required to vanish so the other can remain intact. Her lifelong partner, Jean-Paul Sartre, had written just before her about how fraught this mutual wholeness actually is to achieve, describing love as an almost impossible balancing act, wanting the beloved's freedom to choose you freely, forever, while knowing that a freedom that can choose you can also, at any moment, choose to walk away. He thought this made love a kind of beautiful permanent risk. De Beauvoir agreed that the risk was real. She simply refused to let one partner bear all of it. Which brings the ladder all the way back around. Because if there is a thread running under every tradition gathered here, the Greek ascent, the Indian ache, the Sufi mirror, the Danish sleep, the feminist correction, it is this: love, taken seriously, has never been a resting place. It is not the warm room at the end of a long search. It is a form of attention so complete that it rearranges the person doing the attending. The mystics were right that longing is not a lesser cousin of fulfillment. It can be fulfillment's most honest face. The rationalists were right that a love unwilling to be examined is a love unwilling to be trusted. The existentialists were right that no love is without risk because it requires handing another free being a kind of power over your joy that reason alone can never fully secure, and the correction that was necessary because a love that asks only one person to carry all of that risk was never really love in full. Only love's shape worn by someone standing in for both people at once. What remains when all of this is held together rather than chosen between is something closer to what old Sanskrit poet already knew, even before they had the philosophical vocabulary to defend it, that the ache and the arrival are not two different things, that to love completely is to be, for a while, gloriously unfinished, not because something is missing, but because another person has become quite genuinely part of how you complete a thought. And that emptiness, rightly understood, the emptiness of reaching, of not yet arriving, of loving someone who remains, thankfully, never fully possessible, is not the absence of fullness. It may be the fullest thing a person is capable of feeling. So, let this be what remains when every ladder has been climbed and set back down. That love was never the room at the end of the corridor. It was the corridor itself, and you walking wide awake. Every philosopher who ever tried to hold it still found the same thing waiting under different names. Diotima called it ascent. The poets of Krishna called it ache. Spinoza called it joy with a cause. Kierkegaard called it the leap. And de Beauvoir asked simply that both feet leave the ground together. None of them were wrong. They were standing at different windows of the same house. So if you are loved or loving or only just beginning to, do not wait for the ache to end before you call it whole. The ache was never the crack in the vessel. The ache was the shape the fullness finally took to fit inside a single mortal life. This is the whole of what 2,500 years of thinking has managed to say. Love is not something you fall into and hope it survives the landing. It is the rare, disciplined, terrifying act of staying, attention undivided, long enough for another person to become, quietly, without ceremony, part of how you see at all. Not empty, not finished, only, at last, full.